I'm thinking about bringing Joan up here and letting her serve as my short man. She can, no pun intended, she can stand here and answer questions that I ask her or something like that. I asked her about it, and she said she absolutely refused to do it. I thought I would tell you about issues, about what some of the things about what they've meant to me over the years, and what I've done with them, and what they really are. I'll start out by telling you a couple of stories about how they've been used by people in my local area. Back in my little hometown of Kingsport, Tennessee, and Johnson City, Tennessee, part of the Tri-Cities, is back in the mountains, but they're nice communities and fairly sizable now. But I went to school with a gentleman to law school who always wanted to be a prosecutor for some reason. He wanted to send guilty people to prison. He considered himself, he wanted to be a representative of the people and protect the people from criminals and so forth. So after law school, we went to law school in Memphis, and I stayed in Memphis, and he went back to East Tennessee to seek his career as a prosecutor. And he got hired into the prosecutor's office in Washington County, which is where Johnson City is. It's where I went to undergraduate school there in East Tennessee. And so he was a deputy district attorney back there, but the district attorney, the actual district attorney, had been in office for 20 years or so. It's an elected job. Then he hires all these deputies. So 20 years, no one ever ran against him. And usually when you have that kind of power, there are problems, as there were with this man. Bad things started appearing in the newspapers about him hiring all these felons and different things like that. And my friend Joe, he wanted to be district attorney more than anything else in the world. That was his life's ambition. But in order to do that, he had to run against his boss, a very powerful man. Now that's the district attorney obviously is not, it's a local position, but it's a very important position in the county because that person gets to decide who gets charged and who doesn't. If you have a shooting that is done by a concealed carry holder, does that person get prosecuted or does he not? Those kinds of things. Well, anyway, Joe decided to just go out and run against his boss, and he didn't have any money. And so my point to doing this is to tell you how he did it without any money. All these newspaper ads, or newspaper articles, and different things that started appearing about the district attorney I was telling you about. The newspaper would print some editorial, or there'd be some story about something he had done, and Joe would take that newspaper article, that story, and have it blown up into a big poster. And beside it, he would put his picture and say, "If elected, I won't do this." And he would put those up all over the county, and it only cost him the cost of printing, reprinting those articles. And sometimes he would say, "If elected, I would have done this," or that sort of thing, And they have a lot of parades back there, festivals and things like that. And during one of the parades, I can't remember, 4th of July or something, he got an antique tractor and a flatbed trailer, and he put one of these gigantic posters up in the back of it, and he stood beside it, and they paraded all over town with this thing, with his picture that, "If elected, I won't do this." Anyway, he won. He spent very little money, and he won. He became district attorney. His life's ambition was realized, and he prosecuted a lot of people for murder. He was one of the first. He was a dear friend. That's the reason I'm talking to Joan and me. But he got married, had a happy life, and died of cancer. So there, that's what happens. But he won. That's the point. And he did it with a community where the same person had been elected to the same job for 20 years, and it was obvious that person was going to be elected. But Joe decided it's worth the shot. This is what I've always wanted. Besides, that guy, he was doing bad things, and Joe was able to expose that. So there's some openings for some issues. Joe would take the issues. The issues created themselves. They were all in the newspaper. Another person that comes from my area happens to be a U.S. Congress person now. Her name is Marsha Blackburn. Some of you may have heard of her. She's gotten kind of somewhat prominent during the Trump administration, but Marsha was just a regular old lady living in Memphis. And during the reign of Don Sundquist, who was governor of Tennessee a few terms ago, the worst governor in the history of the state, he was a Republican. But Don Sundquist decided that Tennessee needed an income tax. It had survived since 1816 without an income tax, but he said, if we don't have one right now, this state's going down. And Marsha decided that was not acceptable. A lot of people were outraged about it, and she got on her horse and rode up to Nashville, and she led the movement herself. She just took it on herself and said, this state's not going to have an income tax over my dead body. And she organized movements around the state. She led a car caravan from Memphis to Nashville, which is 200 miles. And they drove around and around the state capitol for hours, and tied up traffic. And some of the guys would give a hand and throw rocks at the building, and she would have to get out from doing that. But anyway, my point is, she parlayed that one issue into a seat in the United States Congress. And right now, she is, Bob Corker, who said some real nasty things about the President Trump. Bob is retiring. He's not going to run for re-election. So Marsha is trying to get his Senate seat. As we all know, being a U.S. Senator is a far better job than being a U.S. Congressman, thanks to the 17th Amendment. So those are two people who took one issue at a time and parlayed it into the job that they dreamed about their entire life. Now, I've met Marsha a couple of times, but anyway, she's all right. I mean, she's a Republican, and she does what the leadership tells her to do. Right now, she's aligned herself straight down the line with President Trump. In fact, I got a fundraising letter the day before we left, and that letter had a picture of President Trump on the front, and it said, we need Marsha Blackburn in the U.S. Senate. So if you follow the leadership, sometimes it pays off. Now, back to the issues for a second. When I was, I've been a candidate twice, as you know, and both of them for vice president and for president. So I started out on the bottom and moved up. But a lot of things, issues became important to me, and I made a living out of the issues because as people were constantly pointing out to me when I was Chuck Baldwin's running mate, thanks to Chuck, I got that opportunity. And he taught me some things about being a candidate. In some ways, he taught me how to look at various things, how to judge what was morally acceptable and what wasn't. I've told the story many times, but Chuck told me, I asked him, some woman in Missouri had offered us $1 million, which is a lot of money to us. $1 million if we would swear that we would work the rest of the campaign, and if we were in office, to end internet gambling, to ban internet gambling. She was a wealthy woman, and she had a a thing about it. And Chuck said, no, we can't do that because the internet's so important, as a communications device, and we oppose any censorship of it or anything like that. And so I said, well, Chuck, if some casino offered us money, if some casino offered us $1 million, would you take it? And he said, well, sure. The devil's had that money long enough. As this gentleman called in, and he asked me, he said, you say you're from the Constitution Party, and you talk about the Constitution as if it's a good thing. But what the Constitution really is a paper that was signed and agreed to hundreds of years ago by a bunch of white slave owners who, we're still prisoners to it today. It still controls us today. So, that's a tough one to just have thrown at you on television. So I said to him, I said, well, you're right about those men a couple hundred years ago that wrote this document. You're right that they were white. You're right that most of them were slave owners. I don't think all of them, but maybe they were. I don't know. But what the Constitution really is the rule of law. See, you think right now, because a person of your choosing that you would vote for, that you probably did vote for, is in office, you think that the majority should rule. You think that if we didn't have this document that enslaves us, that people keep pointing back to, saying, no, you can't do this because this document says you can't. You think that's a bad thing because you feel like you have the majority. It hasn't been that long since you didn't feel that way, has it? There was a very short time ago when you did not have the majority. What if a new person came in and all of a sudden you didn't have the majority anymore? A new president came in and the people voted and decided that, what if people decided to reinstitute all the Jim Crow laws? The majority wants it. I mean, would that be okay? No, obviously it wouldn't be okay because in this country individuals have rights. Individual rights are more important than the entire collective. Your rights as an individual person are more important than what all of these people say. It doesn't matter what they say. You have rights under the Constitution that can't be violated, whether the majority wants them violated or not. So to sum up, the Constitution is a document that protects us from government. It's not something that causes the government angst when it tries to help us. It's something that protects us from the government and the government force. Government is force. Well, anyway, no one knows what the rule of law is, why the rule of law is important. So I developed, in my understanding, my quest to understand the issues, I developed an explanation that I could tell people briefly, more briefly than I'm telling you today, because most interviews and so forth are just sound bites. It's not a debate. They just ask you a question, you answer, move on to something else. But sometimes you're on a radio show or something, and it's a lot more in-depth than that. The radio host, which we can get to in a second, but back to the rule of law, I developed a way of explaining it to people by saying, the rule of law is simply, as it evolved out of the Magna Carta into the Constitution, it is a rule that says everyone is subject to the same law, from the President of the United States to the homeless veteran that sleeps in your park. All are subject to the same law. That is the rule of law. That was the old common law rule, and it still is today if it's enforced. Unfortunately, the rule of law is broken. We can see that quite clearly. The law doesn't apply equally to everybody today, not at all. I mean, there's laws for them and there's laws for us. And sometimes they choose to prosecute each other if it's to their political advantage, but most of the time they don't. That's what needs to be restored in the rule of law. Bad things happen when the rule is broken. Well, where was I a second ago? I was going to talk about something else, but all of a sudden I lost my train of thought and can't remember what it was. I usually ask Joan when she says that, but we are? Yes, that's right, we are. we should be anyway, subject to the same law. The law that says that if you do this, this is a crime, and you'll be prosecuted, whether it's one of us or whether it's someone in government in Washington and the administration, or in the people who would like to be in the administration, instead of being used as a weapon. That is the rule of law. Some other issues that I have confronted over the years that you might want to think about. Let's say that you're not running for president. Let's say that you're running for the school board in your local area, which I used to try to get Joan to do back when we had a daughter in our school system. I said, you should run for the school board. She said, nope, no how, no way will I be a candidate. Anyway, if you were running for the school board today, what would be the issue that you would be most concerned about? What do you think would be the most important issue to any school board member? Yeah, absolutely. Down in Parkland, Florida, that person that killed 17 kids, 17 people, I think a couple of them weren't kids, but that school had 3,000 people in it, 3,000 students. It's like, have you ever seen those old experiments when you were in school where the scientist takes a box and he puts a rat in there, and he puts another rat in there, and he puts 3, 4 more rats in there, and so far the rats are living just happy as they can be. And he just keeps putting rats in, and sometimes one of the rats bites another one. And all of a sudden the 2 rats are fighting, and then all of a sudden the violence just spreads through the whole thing. They're so crowded, there's so much pressure to attack each other that they do. And our school system may be reaching that area. You've seen pictures of the old one-room schoolhouses out on the prairies where a lot of you guys live, out in the deserts of Arizona and Utah, places like that. They probably still have one-room schools out there. I don't know, but back then there was very little peer pressure because all the grades were in the same room, and you have first graders and 12th graders in the same room, and you might have a person in the 5th grade who was one of the smart kids in the class, and he might mentor somebody in the 10th grade who was smart in one thing but not so smart in another. And the kids, I read all this. I mean, I have no experience with one-room schools, but I did read, and I actually had brothers who actually did go to one-room schools. My brother, who was in World War II, did. But the point is, there was very little pressure on the kids because it's different when you have hundreds of kids in the same grade, all packed together, almost the same age. That's where the peer pressure is, the same age. And they have social media now, they have smartphones now, and they're all on there. All the kids are on there, and the pressure is just relentless. Joan and I ride to work every day, usually in the same car. To save money, we take her car because it's more fuel efficient than mine, and I get to ride along and just check out the area while she's driving. And the kids are standing out waiting for the bus in our little community, and they're standing on the street corner, so we see the same kids on the same corner every single day. And every single one of them, without exception, are like this. Every day. And they got their backpacks on with all their books, so they're humped over. And I feel sorry for them because they're probably going back and forth with some other kid who's, what kids do that causes pressure. And sooner or later, like rats, one of them cracks and goes home and gets his gun and starts doing bad stuff. Anyway, that's an issue. You're running for the school board. However you want to phrase it, whatever you want to say about it, you need to answer it. Should teachers be armed? Same issue, just different perspective. Should we give weapons to our teachers? If our teachers have them, should they be able to bring them in? That sort of thing. The other day, a couple of weeks ago, I took my pastor to lunch. He invited me, but I ended up paying for it. But anyway, he and I are engaged in some legal together now. And we went to lunch at this nice restaurant, and they had a big sign on the door that said, "No guns allowed in this building." And I just thought, how stupid it is. Because if I'm going in to rob this building or to commit some act of violence, I'm going to go up to the door and say, I'm going to have to go to a restaurant now where they permit guns. I guess about the only thing you can argue that makes any sense about the sign is that if people obeyed it, you would avoid the type of thing where some permit holder comes into the restaurant, has a few drinks, and gets in almost like a road rage argument with somebody and shoots the person. That actually happened once in Memphis. But they went back out to the parking lot. That's the thing. They went out to the parking lot and one of them shot the other one. So that's an issue of the school board. What about anything in your area that you might be running for? In our little community of Germantown, we would call it alderman. Some areas they might call it the city council or something like that, I guess. But if you were running for alderman in Germantown, one of the issues that you better be able to respond to is property taxes, because property taxes are out of hand. Once our daughter asked me when she was younger how much our property taxes and insurance were, and I told her per month. Suddenly occurred to me that even if you were to give me this house for free, I could not pay the tax. I said, yeah, that is exactly right, and that's a sad state of affairs. You know, many homes and businesses have been lost over that very issue. So what would you say property taxes should do? What would you replace them with? Or if you would replace them, who would fund all these worthwhile projects that the city government's engaged in? In our little community, you have to be able to talk about this, and I'm a keen observer of the community, although I'm just an observer. But I've noticed, and the mayor, she stepped down, and a new mayor came in. I don't really know him. I know some we do, so I could probably talk to him if I wanted to. But the old mayor, I kind of liked her, and she'd been mayor a long time, 20 years or something like that. But I discovered during 2008 that a lot of mayors were into Agenda 21 without really knowing it. And I went back to my hometown. My sister knew the mayor back there real well, and she took me to the mayor, and the mayor brought me over to her house, and we sat in her living room, Joan, me, my sister, and the mayor, and we talked about issues that confronted local communities, issues that maybe people in Washington could affect or something like that. And she just kept telling me all these things that she was doing, these conferences she was going to, these mayors. This is what they tell us. She said, we go to this state meeting, all the mayors, and this is what they tell us that we're supposed to do. And it's like straight out of Agenda 21. I thought, you ever wonder about what that is? You ever think, well, I'm not going to do that? Well, no, you don't ever do that. You don't say, I'm not going to do it. This is just what they tell us to do. That's the leadership. Same thing happens in Congress. I talked to a sitting congressman. It hasn't been that long, and I said to him, why do you say one thing and do another? Why do you talk one way and you vote something different? In Congress now, it's quite easy to determine the issues. All you got to do is go on Google and pull up Congressman Smith's voting record, and it'll spit right out. Anyway, I did that, so I had his record, and I said, why do you say this and then do this? And he said, well, it's the leadership. This is what they want. You do what they want. If you don't do what they want, you'll end up back out on the street looking for a job, or you won't ever advance. You'll be like Ron Paul. You'll stay in Congress forever, but never chair anything. But I said, at least you'd have your integrity. He said, yeah, well, that's something, I guess. But anyway, it's the leadership, even on a mayoral level. It's the leadership in our community. Joan and I, as I was telling you, we live in Germantown, which is just a paradise type of community there in the bean fields of West Tennessee. You have to see it to believe it. It really is. But it's the same thing. Mayor Goldsworthy, she was big into Agenda 21. She painted all these things on the street, these green lines that point you in the direction you're supposed to go. They build a new school. They voted the money to build this new school. There's no way to get to it. You cannot get to that school on foot because it's a busy highway on both sides. I mean, you kids can't walk along that street. So even people who live just a short distance from the school will have to be driven or picked up from a bus. So it's a consolidating type thing to bring all those people out from outlying communities into a centralized location. She did a lot of other things, bike paths, all painted green, different things like that. But anyway, it's a great community, but stuff like that you wonder about. And people build homes. Everywhere there's a tree, there'll soon be a home or some business or something. But that's just my extra grant. So that's property taxes. What do you think should be done about taxes? Tax was a big issue for me in 2016. Everywhere I went, people would ask me about my tax plan. And you've heard the hot mic comments, when you think the mic's off, but it's still on and you're talking. One time after I finished my interview, people said, did you hear what they said later? And I said, no, I didn't. And they said, well, they were talking and you could still hear them. And they were saying, that tax plan he's got is pretty interesting. I'd kind of like to see if he could actually do that. And anyway, the tax plan was just what the Constitution Party platform says. That's all it was. But I have to admit, I jazzed it up a little bit, but it was basically just the Constitution Party platform that's been there for all this time. So you have to be able to deal with taxes, that's my point. And as I get ready to close out, let me tell you that Jim Clymer said something back there. I keep telling Jim he's starting to look like David Letterman now in his retirement. But Jim said that when he was running for the Senate a few years ago, he got invited to some type of event where the Democrats and Republicans were there, but they did not invite the Libertarian candidate or the Green Party candidate or any other third party candidate. He asked the person why that was, and the person said, because you act like a real candidate. In other words, Jim was being, he wanted the office, and he felt like if he were elected, he could actually be a senator. You ever had somebody that's running and you think you'd be terrified if they actually won? Well, you don't want that for yourself. You want to feel like in your own heart, you want to feel like you could actually hold that office, and then you act accordingly. Jim had put up signs, and he was giving speeches and actually running a real campaign. And the same thing happened to me on a lesser scale. When I went back to my hometown, I called the political writer from my hometown newspaper, and I wanted desperately to get a local boy makes good story on the front page, because I wanted all my relatives and friends from where I grew up to see that I was a candidate for president. So I sat down, the political writer agreed to see me. And I went in his office. I think you were with me, weren't you, John? Yeah, she was there. And so he started asking me questions. And he said, everybody wants me to cover their campaign. All these candidates want me to. And I tell them, first you have to have a campaign. If I'm going to cover your campaign, it actually has to be a campaign. I said, well, I've got a real campaign. And I showed him all the Constitution Party, the literature that I had. I showed him our website. And he said, okay. I said, besides, Local Boy Makes Good is a good story, isn't it? And he said, yeah, it's a good story. So he asked me about the issues, what issues I stood for, what the Constitution Party was, what what his most important issues were, and I told him about, pro-life, the basic 7 things that are on the website, and when they printed the article, it was right on the front page with a big picture and a big section with those 7 things, right on it, a big whole, like a half-page story on the front page. I was so excited about it because, no one back there actually believed the story. My brother, who is dead now, but was a Korean War Marine, he died at age 85. He told me that is the first time he voted since Korea. He registered to vote so he could vote for me. And this last election, he told my sister, my sister is a Democrat. He told my sister, he said, "I'm sure glad Darrell's running for president." She said, "Well, why?" He said, "Because that means you can't vote for Hillary Clinton." Anyway, folks, you have to pick out your own issues, your own favorite ones, but some have to be, they have to be talked about. And you can, as Jim said today, you can be a real candidate by understanding the issues and talking about them with people, not being afraid of them, and showing that you have an answer that perhaps other people don't have. All right? Thank you very much.